August 13th, 1998. The location was Moscow, but the tremors would be felt in every financial capital on Earth. Inside the marble halls of the Central Bank of Russia, behind closed doors on the 7th floor, a group of officials sat around a conference table that had hosted countless policy meetings before. But this morning was different. The air was thick with something unseen, something that couldn't be measured by the instruments economists typically used. They were waiting for confirmation of numbers they already knew were catastrophic, waiting for phone calls from foreign creditors who would demand explanations no one could provide. The tension in that room was not theatrical. It was the quiet, suffocating pressure that comes when intelligent people realize they are out of options. Outside those windows, Moscow continued its daily rhythm. Markets opened. Traders arrived at their desks. Currency exchanges posted their rates. But the people in that room knew something the public did not yet grasp. The system had already broken. The question was no longer whether Russia would survive the crisis, but whether the global financial architecture could withstand what was about to happen. The meeting had been called for 8 in the morning, but several officials arrived earlier. They stood by the windows, coffee cups in hand, staring out at a city that had no idea what was coming. One advisor checked his watch repeatedly. Another reviewed documents he had already memorized. The central bank governor sat at the head of the table, his face expressionless, his hands folded in front of him. He had been in this position for less than a year. He inherited an economy already teetering, already damaged by years of mismanagement and structural flaws that predated his appointment. Now he would be the one to announce the unthinkable at exactly 8:15. The door opened. A junior staffer entered with a single sheet of paper. He walked to the governor and placed it face down on the table. No words were exchanged. The governor turned the paper over, read it once, then read it again. He nodded slowly. The staffer left. The room remained silent. What was written on that page was the confirmation of a reality that had been building for months. Russia's foreign currency reserves were nearly exhausted. The government could not meet its debt obligations. The ruble was in free fall, and in less than 72 hours, the entire structure of Russia's post-Soviet economy would collapse. Most people believe that economic crises announced themselves clearly. The headlines during the summer of 1998 told a story that seemed straightforward. Russian markets under pressure, ruble weakens amid budget concerns. IMF discusses emergency measures. The official narrative presented by both Russian officials and international observers was that this was a containable situation. Yes, there were fiscal problems. Yes, there was political instability. But Russia was too important, too connected, too large to truly fail. The widely accepted view among Western economists was that Russia might need another bailout, another round of loans, another restructuring agreement. It had happened before. It could happen again. This belief was not irrational. Russia had received substantial international support throughout the 1990s. The IMF had already provided billions in emergency financing. Western governments had a vested interest in Russia's stability. The logic was simple. Crises were manageable if the right people made the right decisions at the right time. If Russia tightened its budget, if it collected taxes more effectively, if it reformed its banking sector, the crisis would pass. Markets would stabilize. Investors would return. The narrative was clean, linear, and reassuring. It fit the model of how economies were supposed to work. Even sophisticated investors operated under this assumption. Hedge funds had poured money into Russian government bonds, known as SOKOs, because they offered extraordinarily high yields. The risk seemed acceptable because Russia, as a nuclear superpower with vast natural resources, was considered too big to fail. Investment banks in New York and London treated Russian debt as a lucrative opportunity, not an existential threat. The consensus was that volatility was temporary. Corrections were normal. Panic was irrational. This was the framework through which the world interpreted what was happening in Moscow during those critical weeks. But the reality was different. What was rarely discussed in public would remain buried in the technical reports circulated only among central bankers and senior policymakers. Was that Russia's crisis was not a liquidity problem. It was a solvency problem. The overlooked detail, the one that would shatter the official narrative, was this. Russia's government was funding its operations almost entirely through short-term debt that had to be rolled over every few weeks. This created a trap. As confidence eroded, the interest rates demanded by investors rose. Higher interest rates meant the government had to borrow even more just to pay the interest on existing debt. This spiral was unsustainable. And by August 19, it had reached the point of no return. The structure of Russia's debt was fundamentally unstable. GKOs were denominated in rubles, but foreign investors who purchased them expected to convert their returns into dollars. This meant the Central Bank of Russia had to maintain enough foreign currency reserves to satisfy redemptions. But reserves were finite, and as capital fled the country, reserves drained faster than they could be replenished. The government faced a choice: default on domestic debt, default on foreign debt, or devalue the currency so drastically that it would trigger inflation and economic collapse. There was no fourth option behind closed doors. Russian officials had been negotiating with the IMF for months, but the conditions attached to international assistance were politically impossible. The IMF demanded deep cuts to government spending, tax increases, and structural reforms that would take years to implement. Meanwhile, the crisis was measured in days. The mismatch between the speed of financial contagion and the pace of institutional reform created a gap that could not be bridged. By mid-August, even IMF officials privately acknowledged that the situation was beyond their standard toolkit. Asterisk. What made this crisis different from previous emerging market collapses was the scale of Russia's integration into global finance. Russian banks owed money to Western banks. Russian companies had borrowed in international markets. Russian assets were held in portfolios across Europe, Asia, and the United States. A default would not be contained. It would ripple outward, exposing vulnerabilities in institutions that seemed entirely separate from Russia's domestic economy. The system was interconnected in ways that were invisible until stress revealed the hidden linkages. To understand the scale of what was unfolding, you have to grasp how deeply Russia's financial system had become embedded in the global economy during the 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia opened its markets to foreign investment. Western capital flooded in, seeking high returns in a newly capitalist economy. By 1998, foreign investors held tens of billions of dollars in Russian assets. Major banks in the United States and Europe had significant exposure. Hedge funds had leveraged positions that assumed Russian debt would be repaid. This created a chain reaction mechanism that few people fully understood. If Russia defaulted, foreign creditors would suffer immediate losses. Those losses would force them to liquidate other assets to cover their positions. That liquidation would depress prices in other markets. Other investors, seeing falling prices, would sell preemptively. Panic would spread. The initial shock in Moscow could trigger a cascade that reached New York, London, Tokyo, and beyond. This was not theoretical. It was the fundamental architecture of modern finance. Risk was distributed across borders, across institutions, across asset classes. And when one node failed, the entire network felt the strain. The stakes were not just financial, they were geopolitical. Russia was a nuclear power. It had a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Its stability mattered for reasons that went beyond balance sheets and bond yields. Western governments understood that a total economic collapse in Russia could lead to political chaos, social unrest, and unpredictable consequences for global security. The financial crisis was occurring in a context where the margin for error was perilously thin. An economic disaster could destabilize a region that was already fragile. The potential for irreversible damage extended far beyond the ruble exchange rate. Challenge one was the immediate liquidity crisis facing Russia's banking system. Banks operate on the assumption that depositors will not all withdraw their money at the same time. But in August 1998, that assumption collapsed. Russians who had savings began pulling cash out of banks. They converted rubles into dollars. They moved money abroad. They bought physical assets. The velocity of withdrawals accelerated daily. Banks that had seemed stable suddenly faced runs. And because Russian banks were interconnected through a web of interbank loans, the failure of one institution threatened others. The Central Bank of Russia tried to stem the outflow by raising interest rates. At one point, overnight rates exceeded 100% annually, but higher rates did not restore confidence. They signaled desperation. Foreign investors, seeing the astronomical cost of borrowing, concluded that the government was out of options. They sold their holdings and left the market. Domestic investors followed. The liquidity trap tightened. Every intervention designed to stabilize the system instead accelerated its disintegration. This constraint was not unique to Russia. It is a feature of fractional reserve banking. But in Russia, the problem was compounded by the lack of institutional credibility. The central bank had limited tools, the government had limited fiscal space, and the international community, though willing to provide rhetorical support, was unwilling to commit the scale of resources necessary to truly backstop the system. The result was a slow-motion collapse that everyone could see coming, but no one could stop. Challenge 2 was the debt spiral itself. By the summer of 1998, the Russian government was spending more than 40% of its budget just servicing debt. Tax collection was weak. Revenues were falling. The only way to meet obligations was to borrow more. But as mentioned, borrowing required paying higher and higher interest rates. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more Russia borrowed, the more it owed. The more it owed, the less confidence investors had. The less confidence investors had, the higher the rates they demanded. There was no precedent in modern financial history for a major economy to escape this spiral without either defaulting or receiving a bailout. So large, it effectively transferred the problem to someone else. The Russian government explored every alternative. It negotiated with the IMF. It sought bilateral assistance from the United States, Germany, and Japan. It proposed restructuring its debt. It considered capital controls, but every option had fatal flaws. The IMF's conditions were politically toxic. Bilateral assistance came with strings attached. Restructuring required creditor agreement, and creditors were fragmented and uncooperative. Capital controls would destroy what little confidence remained. The government was trapped in a maze where every path led to disaster. Officials worked around the clock during those final days, running simulations, consulting with foreign advisors, holding emergency cabinet meetings. But the numbers did not change. The debt was unsustainable. The reserves were depleted. The markets were closed. On August 17, 1998, the Russian government announced a unilateral moratorium on debt payments and allowed the ruble to collapse. It was not a decision. It was an inevitability that had been building for years behind the scenes. There was an infrastructure that made Russia's collapse both predictable and unavoidable. This infrastructure was not a physical thing. It was the set of rules, expectations, and automatic mechanisms embedded in global finance. When Russia's credit rating was downgraded, certain institutional investors were required by their own bylaws to sell Russian assets. This selling was not discretionary. It was automatic. Pension funds, insurance companies, and mutual funds had mandates that specified acceptable risk levels. When Russia crossed a threshold, the sell orders were triggered mechanically. Similarly, derivative contracts linked to Russian debt contained clauses that activated when certain conditions were met. These clauses forced counterparties to post additional collateral or unwind positions. The invisible pressure point was that these contracts were not negotiable in real time. They were binding agreements that executed according to preset rules. So even if individual traders or executives wanted to avoid panic selling, the legal structure of their positions left them no choice. The system enforced its own logic. This infrastructure also included the international clearing and settlement systems that processed cross-border transactions. When Russia imposed capital controls, transactions that were already in process were frozen. Payments that should have settled did not. This created a backlog that rippled through correspondent banking networks. Banks in one country could not reconcile their accounts with banks in another. The friction multiplied. What began as a Russian problem became a global settlement problem. The invisible gears of international finance, normally functioning smoothly and unnoticed, suddenly seize the deeper you look. The clearer it becomes that no single actor controlled the outcome. The crisis was a product of the system's design. Russia's choices were constrained by the choices made by investors, who were constrained by the choices made by regulators, who were constrained by international agreements that had been negotiated years earlier. The infrastructure was a web of dependencies where everyone was simultaneously a cause and a victim. The turning point came on the afternoon of August 16th. A major Russian bank, one of the largest in the country, failed to meet a payment obligation to a European counterparty. The amount was not enormous by global standards, but the failure was symbolic. It proved that the contagion had reached institutions that were supposed to be safe. Word spread through trading floors in London and New York within minutes. Brokers who had been cautiously optimistic suddenly reversed their positions. The line had been crossed. There was no margin for error that evening. The Russian government convened an emergency session. The Prime Minister, the central bank governor, the finance minister, and several senior advisors met in a secure location. The agenda was brief. Decide whether to default before the markets opened the next day or attempt one final intervention. The discussion lasted less than 2 hours. There was no real debate. The reserves were gone. The IMF package was insufficient. The political will to impose further austerity did not exist. The only question was how to communicate the decision at midnight. The statement was drafted. It said a 90-day moratorium on payments to foreign creditors, a devaluation of the ruble, and the restructuring of domestic debt. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, almost boring, but the implications were catastrophic. When Asian markets opened a few hours later, the sell-off was immediate. Russian assets became untradeable. The ruble lost more than half its value in a single day. Banks across Moscow closed their doors. ATMs ran out of cash. The crisis that had been simmering for months reached its climax in a matter of hours in the end. They chose to default, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The decision was not a failure of leadership or a lack of courage. It was the logical endpoint of a process that began years earlier with unsustainable fiscal policies, ineffective tax collection, and a political system incapable of making hard choices. By August 1998, every alternative had been exhausted. The government could not borrow more. It could not print money without triggering hyperinflation. It could not raise taxes fast enough to close the deficit. The The constraints were absolute. What is often forgotten in retrospect is that the officials making these decisions were not reckless or incompetent. They were highly educated economists and experienced policymakers who understood the consequences of their actions. They knew that default would devastate the economy. They knew it would destroy Russia's international reputation. They knew it would inflict severe hardship on ordinary citizens. But they also knew that the alternative, attempting to maintain an unsustainable system for a few more weeks, would only make the eventual collapse worse. The decision was rational within the constraints they faced. But rationality under duress is not freedom. It is the narrowing of choices until only one path remains. The officials in that room on August 16th were not exercising power. They were acknowledging its limits. They signed documents that formalized what the markets had already determined. And when the statement was released to the public the next morning, it did not come as a surprise to those who had been paying attention. It came as a confirmation the long-term impact of the 1998 crisis was borne most heavily by ordinary people who had no role in creating the conditions that led to collapse. Within days, the price of imported goods skyrocketed. The ruble's devaluation made basic necessities unaffordable for millions. Families that had modest savings saw their purchasing power evaporate. Pensions that were already inadequate became worthless. Unemployment rose as businesses failed and foreign investment disappeared. The downstream effects were brutal and immediate, but the burden extended beyond material hardship. The crisis shattered trust in institutions. Russians who had cautiously embraced market reforms in the 1990s now saw those reforms as a betrayal. The banks that had promised security failed. The government that had promised stability defaulted. The international community that had promised support provided loans with conditions that made recovery harder, not easier. The psychological damage was profound. A generation learned that the system could not be trusted, that savings could vanish overnight, that promises were contingent. The social consequences persisted for years. Income inequality widened. Those with access to foreign currency or hard assets protected themselves. Those without pension, as public sector workers, the rural poor suffered disproportionately. Health outcomes deteriorated. Life expectancy declined. The crises did not just reset the economy. It reset expectations about what was possible and whom the system served. The official statistics would eventually show recovery, but the lived experience of millions told a different story. The uncomfortable truth revealed by Russia's 1998 collapse is that modern financial systems are far more fragile than they appear. The deeper pattern is not about Russian exceptionalism or policy failures unique to Moscow. It is about the structural reality of interconnected debt, leveraged positions, and automated responses to stress. What happened in Russia could happen elsewhere. It has happened elsewhere. And it will happen again. The crisis demonstrated that sovereignty in a globalized economy is constrained by forces beyond any single government's control. Russia could not unilaterally decide to stabilize its currency. It needed the cooperation of foreign creditors, international institutions, and market participants who operated according to their own incentives. When those incentives aligned against stability, no amount of domestic policy adjustment could counteract the pressure. The system was designed to respond to signals, credit ratings, interest rate spreads, reserve levels. And when those signals turned negative, the response was automatic and unforgiving. This is the structural reality that most people never see. They see the headlines. They see the leaders making announcements. They see the recovery plans and the reform proposals. But beneath all of that is an infrastructure of rules, contracts, and mechanisms that enforce outcomes independent of intention. The 1998 crisis was not a deviation from how the system works. It was a demonstration of how the system works when stress is applied. The machinery revealed itself. There is a line that captures what happened during those 72 hours in August 1998. It was not spoken by a politician or written by a famous economist. It exists to describe a truth that applies far beyond Russia. The collapse was not a failure of the system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed, protecting itself by sacrificing those least able to bear the cost of the events of August 1998. Ramin was death. Understanding financial crises requires looking beyond individual decisions and examining the hidden architecture that shapes what is possible. The debt structures, the settlement systems, the automatic triggers embedded in contracts. These are the forces that determine outcomes when pressure builds. Russia's default was not an anomaly. It was a preview of how fragile the global financial system truly is when stress tests its limits. This is the financial coin historian. The lesson from those 72 hours is not that better leaders or smarter policies would have prevented the crisis. The lesson is that the system itself contains the seeds of its own instability. And when those seeds germinate, the cost is paid not by the architects of the system, but by the people who trusted it to work. The machinery of finance moves quietly, invisibly, until it breaks. And when it breaks fast.